So this paper is in three parts. I'm going to start by talking about care, that volatile buzzword, which is at its best, I think, something which signifies the capacity to nurture and sustain all that's necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life through mutuality and interdependency. And as requested, I will expand on that definition a little bit shortly. Then in the second third, I'm going to consider its opposite, carewashing, the co-optation of care, or the mobilisation of an idea of care against itself. And then lastly, I'll discuss how we might separate these two phenomena from each other when it might not be clear, drawing on the example of care and community that is offered these days by universities. So throughout this, I'm broadly arguing that there is a political battle over who should control care, or who should be understood as its rightful custodian.
The keyboard.
Yeah, that's good. So in the process, what this paper does is try to draw a thread between different strands of work that I've been involved with over the past 5 years, some of which Rosella just talked about. From the Care Manifesto to work I've done recently on education and care, to a new book that I'm developing with Andreas Hatzidakis, one of my co-authors from the Care Manifesto, and the Canadian legal academic Joel Bakken, called Corporate Carewashing. So the paper draws, in other words, from these three areas. So to begin with, what is care? Why has it acquired a buzzword currency these days? Why do we need it? And why has it been so undervalued? We considered these questions in the Care Manifesto, which was a collaborative book that I co-authored with Andreas Hatzidakis, Jamie Hakim, Lynn Siegel, and Catherine Rottenberg, which, as Rosella mentioned, was published in the midst of the pandemic. And we're currently thinking about starting to update it into a second edition of the book, which is quite challenging given everything which has happened in our omni-crisis times. So to summarise it briefly, as a manifesto, what it does is argue that we should put care at the centre of life on different scales and levels, from the interpersonal to community, to the state, to the planetary environment. And we defined care in what was, to some, a fairly controversial broad fashion as I mentioned before, something which gives us the capacity to nurture and sustain all that's necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life through mutuality and interdependency. So the manifesto begins by diagnosing the state that we're in, which it defines as a state of structural carelessness, and which it argues has been caused to a significant degree over the past 4 decades by neoliberal capitalism, and which has been exacerbated during the past 15 to 20 years by austerity politics. It highlights how care services are increasingly broken, out of reach, privatised, like much of the public sector over the past 4 decades. And it discusses how we're incited to do endless self-care on a private individual basis and to act increasingly in terms of extremely defensive self-interest. Whilst at the same time, in effect, the public sphere, the public realm has been used as a reservoir that corporations can draw the life from before pumping out their dirty waste back into it, sometimes quite literally. So in other words, it looks at the beginning at these kind of forms of structural carelessness and their political economy, and argues that public structures of care have been extensively asset stripped by private corporations. And the kind of key kind of thrust of the argument is to say, what would it mean? What would it look like if we took this idea of care seriously if we took it as the organising principle for life rather than, say, profit. And we argue that care is an issue which has been repudiated and disavowed for so long. And obviously, we're not the first to argue this at all. There's a vast literature arguing this. Care has been repudiated and disavowed for so long because, as well as being associated with the feminine and being badly paid, it's often working class women and migrants that do what Mignon Duffy once called the dirty work of caring jobs, for instance. And this process, as it sounds like you've been looking at over the course of the series, has longer roots in imperial, industrial and racial capitalism, as Pramila Nadesan and Francois Verger's new books, respectively Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and Making the World Clean, make so clear. So that's how we start. We start with this diagnosis of structural carelessness, and we look at the different genealogies that led us to this place. We draw some kind of quite broad brush threads as to why this situation or conjuncture of structural carelessness has arisen, how we might understand it. And then the rest of the book, which is, as you can see, quite short, is a thought experiment on what it might look like to prioritise care in different domains and levels of life. So we advocate very hard for universal care, for putting care at the front and the centre, and for sharing the labour and the joys of care in a more socially equitable fashion. And how we do this, how we talk about it, is to give a range of different examples of what we term progressive care in practice, from the radical past to the recent present. So we provide a whole series of different kind of miniature vignettes or case studies of what might be, inspirational, practical examples of what collective forms of care might look like. So we do discuss kind of distinctions between hands-on care and other forms of care, such as care receiving, for example, caregiving. But we also adopt this quite deliberately, this expansive use of the word in order to indicate its wider role in the capacity and having the capacity and the activity to nurture all that's necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life. So this is broad, and it includes, for example, the need to work against environmental collapse and newly vicious forms of xenophobic bordering. So we participate, in other words, in a wider, longer tradition that you might say includes Joan Tronto and Beveridge, of taking a very expansive approach to care. And like other care theorists, including, say, Nancy Fraser, Emma Dowling, Kathleen Lynch, we're also very concerned with the politics and the political economies of care. So we argue that this is particularly important when so much of the rhetoric around care is trained towards hyper-individualized self-care, the unending kind of exhortations in consumer capitalism to buy me time, to use scented candles, which take us far away from what Audre Lorde meant by the phrase of self-care, which was in fact a restoration for her of the capacities of the self to prepare for interconnected forms of political action. So we argue kind of strongly that care, to think about care, has to involve emphasizing interdependence. And this is important when you have this kind of very individualistic form of self-care discourse, which is prominent in circulating in our culture. So the book was part of a wider tendency of expansion in the term care's use. It was published at a time when policy work, journalistic pieces, think tank and work in academic literature on care was mushrooming worldwide. And this was partly, though not exclusively, due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's because of the crisis in care, and it was also exacerbated at this time because it became something that was suddenly talked about a lot. So care is a very malleable word. And in her book on freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, Maggie Nelson, drawing on Wittgenstein, argues that the word care's meaning is in its use. And I would say that it's very important to distinguish between care as a kind of ideal or normative theory and practice, or the best of what it is, what it can be, what it should be, and care as a kind of malleable ideological discourse which can mutate, be articulated to very different political acts or ends with powerful material effects. But I think it's important to look at how care travels as a word, how this discourse can mutate and shape in meaning. So, for example, during the pandemic, the word became used in ways which I would argue are decidedly uncaring. As in Matt Hancock clapping for carers and holding up a badge saying care for the cameras, whilst refusing to give nurses a pay rise or supply adequate PPE. And this is what the sociologists Beverly Skeggs and Helen Wood called offering care gratitude rather than care justice. I think we can also see it in the proclamations of care that are made at times by corporations. So carewashing, as you mentioned, is a term that my colleague Andreas Hatzidakis coined, which we mentioned in the Care Manifesto, and which has become a more widely used term since. So it's a term that's used to echo other forms of corporate whitewashing, such as philanthrocapitalism, greenwashing, or pinkwashing. And we use it to refer to how corporations use a language of care to distract from their different degrees and forms of environmental and social exploitation. So this, of course, is a practice which predates the pandemic. You might think of all the civic buildings named after ruthless industrial 19th century colonial capitalists who wanted their names washed clean and immortalized via naming strategies and practices in museums. So you might think here of sugar magnate Henry Tate or the Sackler wing, how that having your name on a building is a way to make you seem noble and to dispense from the connotations of colonial slavery or the opioid epidemic. But carewashing has this longer genealogy, but it also is a practice which exacerbated during the pandemic. So what Andreas and I did in an article that we wrote during the pandemic as Fun Times, we kind of developed a taxonomy of carewashing. And we grouped carewashing, as we read it, that was being practiced by corporations, into 3 broad categories, to which we have in the last few months added a 4th category. So I'll just talk about these different categories and what they signify. So the first category, opportunistic branding, is perhaps the most basic form of corporate carewashing. Since the height of the COVID pandemic, it's involved suggesting that using a particular corporate product is a way of mediating and facilitating care for ourselves and for others. So, for instance, price gouging over the hand washing and opportunistic forms of care branding were rife during the early months of the pandemic. If you remember, Carex soap, for example, heavily pushed care in its marketing strategy, boosting its profits quite extensively, whilst at the same time, it could be pointed out that it scored 8 out of 20 on its ethical record in the Ethical Consumer Index, and the company is one which has been specifically targeted by Greenpeace over its environmental record. So that's perhaps the most basic form of carewashing. The second category that we identified is where corporations present themselves as both a resource for and a generator of community care. So we noticed how a number of brands at this time were drawing on tropes of community mutual aid, care and solidarity, all of which were practices which have been significantly revived during the first lockdown through the creation of grassroots local mutual aid groups. For example, for the telecommunications company giffgaff, a good community would be made up of caring individuals. For detergent brand Fairy, community is kindness, and HSBC thanks all our local heroes. So in branding terms, what this would be called is a form of piggyback marketing, whereby brands jump on the bandwagon of the popularity of caring communities that are kind of flourishing in the social world and their heroes. Or what Grant McCracken once called meaning transfer, where meanings are appropriated by brands from other socio-cultural realms. And it's worth noticing as well how a significant number of corporations also published the care resources they linked with or developed and their links with care-related charities. So, for example, Fairy, again, offered seminars on how to deal with anxiety in lockdown. Dove produced campaigns that domestic care work should be more fairly distributed and partnered with the global charity MENCare to campaign for men's mental health. So these issues, these practices publicise issues of inequality and social justice, issues which are important, issues which definitely need to be dealt with. Yet they can also simultaneously be understood as corporations glossing their problematic practices, such as their engagement with fossil fuels, exploitative forms of production, their enlargement of relations of inequality, with the affect of care through cause-related marketing. So in other words, we can, I think, understand such care-washing practices in part as what in the book Against Meritocracy I termed neoliberal justice narratives, which act by raising issues of inequality and then presenting neoliberal corporate control and power as the social solution to those ills. Okay, so thirdly, we have the category care as a kind of relentless marketing bulldozer in which a gestural statement of care runs entirely against what the company in question was widely known to be doing. So care as reputational steamroller are attempts to counteract bad publicity and to aggressively manufacture reputational benefits. So Amazon, for instance, a corporation which is notorious for repeatedly failing to care for workers' health and safety standards to the extent that it was ordered by a court in France to close its factories, nonetheless produced a campaign claiming keeping our people safe whilst getting you the things you need has never been more important. And I think there's a correlation here between, so the fake news of right-wing politicians claiming that they're doing something whilst actually doing the exact opposite, or what the sociologist Lindsay McGooey has termed strategic ignorance. Then similarly, you have Primark launching the Primark Cares initiative, expressing an ostensible commitment to being a responsible retailer and taking care of our people and the planet, whilst at the same time not stopping selling vast amounts of fast fashion, damaging both people working in their supply chains and the wider ecosystem. So these are very extreme examples, but they also highlight a common denominator across care-washing campaigns, that corporate care is only practiced selectively and inconsistently. As Joel Bakken has put it, corporations are now legally treated with the rights of a person, yet whilst as capitalist organisations they put profit as their key driver, they cannot satisfy care needs in the same way that either humans or cooperatives or democratically governed institutions can. So in his book and film, the corporation. Backhands can see is that if the corporation now is given the same legal rights as a person, we might ask, what kind of person is it? And his answer is, it is a psychopath. And then in his more recent book, The New Corporation, which looks at corporate involvement in charity campaigns and philanthrocapitalism, he argues that it's not just a psychopath, it's a very charming psychopath. So that's kind of how we came to work together, and while we're doing this new work on corporate carewashing. So carewashing, we would argue, must therefore be understood not only as reflective of quite short-term reputational benefits that arose after the advent of COVID, but we would argue as part of a broader tectonic shift in which corporations are attempting to increase their power by presenting themselves as rightful custodians of the social, of, for instance, the realm of mental health or of education, which is echoed in the language of compassionate, caring, or stakeholder capitalism. So carewashing, in other words, is part of a wider attempt to legitimise corporations as the natural and common sense custodians of care and of social life. In the Gramscian sense, we might say it's part of a stealthy, passive revolution, which is attempting to claim and demarcate the realm of care for corporate capitalism and against social democracy. So this is all to argue that the word care can be used against itself. It can be taken from us, it can be used against us. And I think Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, is very good at pointing out how words can be twisted in this way. So in this book, she writes about her early book, The Shock Doctrine, with its critique of corporations exploiting crisis to extend their profits, became itself, drawn on by far-right conspiracy theorists in order to perpetuate corporate power and the kind of budgets of billionaires. So we might say that no word can escape being contested, and the use of words is always a struggle for meaning. But it also regularly connects, directly or indirectly, to the struggle for social and political resources. And because their primary goal is extensive profit for the few, what happens when we depend on corporations as custodians of care is that they can also give it up at their whim. They can dump the EDI or the DEI. They can insist that, say, rich white men possess the most merit. They can do what Andreas Hatzidakis, Joel Bakan and I are now terming care stripping. And this is the naked form of corporate barbarism, which strips institutions and people of the capacities for care. Notoriously, Elon Musk has recently said that empathy is destroying civilization. So we have the kind of expansion of this form of care stripping happening around us right now. And so this brings me to the university. So I recently wrote an article about care and the lack of care in universities, during which I became quite preoccupied by how some of the most kind of ridiculous and palpable examples of carewashing over the past few years are university initiatives which brand themselves as caring whilst being anything but. But to say this isn't to say that, necessarily university initiatives on care are uncaring. I can think of, quite a few that are beneficial, from research initiatives on care, your seminar series, to campaigns against sexual violence, for example. But at the same time, it is undoubtedly the case that this word has also been used strategically in university settings against itself. So, for example, during the second COVID lockdown, when I was working full-time doing university teaching online and kind of dealing with the many students with mental health issues, while simultaneously trying to educate or supervise the school education of my two kids and to keep in touch with older dependent relatives, the university I worked in didn't in any way at that time minimize teaching hours for people with caring responsibilities. Instead, what they did was to provide extra online seminars run by an outsourced, privatised corporate care contractor. So I was asked by my union branch to go to this seminar and report back. And I decided to attend a seminar on balancing work with home education for children that was kind of being pitched at people like me. It was only a seminar which was offered to university employees. And it was touted as something which would help staff balance their own difficult care demands, as carers with their workloads in the university. So, I mean, I know that people had very different experiences during lockdown. Some people had a lot of free time. Others were doing kind of military operations. Other people were in ICUs. But, I was one of these people who was trying to shepherd kids through schools, very ridiculously complicated online learning systems, and navigate platforms and do multiple tasks at the same time as trying to teach hundreds of students, many of whom had their own issues and problems during lockdown. So I went to this seminar for help and advice, but this corporate care seminar, it turned out, was run by homeschool enthusiasts who were advocating opting out of the state school system altogether in favour of full-time parent-led homeschooling education. So the advice that was given to me and to my colleagues was to use this time to step back from the curriculum and encourage my children's interests. So, for example, they said maybe they had an interest in Michelin cooking that had never been able to develop. You might want to go and do that with them in the kitchen with all your acres of free time. Or maybe you could teach them coding. Maybe they want to be the next Elon Musk. And this advice, for me, could not have been any less useful or any less inappropriate, less appropriate rather. So despite being a provision offered by the university, it failed to recognise that the overwhelming majority of participants had jobs, in addition to suddenly very rapidly increased caring needs. And many participants were seen typing extremely frustrated comments into the chat function. And I think why this is interesting is because of what it indicates about the wider trends in institutions around care. So the provision of courses like this are, in a Foucauldian sense, responsibilizing the employee to deal with impossible structural conditions and problems, which are not useful, which are paid for at great expense by public money to privatized contractors under the guise of care when they are anything but. And so to me, this is a kind of like both a galling and a really incisive miniature example, or metonymic example of an uncaring system. Another one, post-pandemic, was the luxurious wellness pod, which suddenly appeared in the foyer of the university that I was working in. And now this was a small wooden structure which looked a bit like a luxury playpen with plastic foliage all around it and a reclining kind of massage sofa inside. And it sat there in situ for several months, right in the middle of a very, very busy building entrance. So it never seemed to be used. It didn't seem to be allowed to be used, but instead it was the kind of subject of hollow, sardonic laughter and fascination for both staff and students alike. And so this wellness pod, as it was called, seemed to function primarily as a 3D site-specific advert, a form of opportunistic branding, you might say, for corporate wellness, a bolt-on extra, which, like the seminar, didn't in any way fulfill its purpose. So it appeared at the same time as staff morale and as wellness, as measured in global surveys, was notably quite low and plummeting upon year. And it chimed with how announcements of large-scale redundancies in universities are now often made with reference to the institutional wellness services on offer. So how do these strategies of care provided by universities connect to or diverge from those which Andreas and I identified as corporate carewashing branding strategies? They do not fit seamlessly within any of our three typologies of corporate carewashing, but they do share very pronounced commonalities with them. The Wellness Pod and the Corporate Care Seminar both function as an opportunistic internal and external branding strategy. They're clearly intended to function as proof that the university does care, tuning into the discursive popularity of the language of care, which has exploded in recent years. They attempt to appear like they're building a form of community, in that they're offering a communal resource. They're pitched at internal employees rather than external consumers, which also produces an extra layer of cognitive dissonance. And so they're perhaps most similar in some ways to the category of reputational steamroller, bulldozing away current or prospective charges that the university does not care. They attempt to flatten out cognitive dissonance. So crucially, I would say these processes devolve the outsourcing of care to an external locus of responsibility, rather than an integral internal component of structural working conditions. And this relates how, in the neoliberal era, public sector institutions tend to farm out their problems and risks to inflated consultancies and accountancy firms. It means, as Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington have argued in their book, The Big Con, that they are unable themselves to learn institutional lessons from their mistakes. And in effect, they are forced to be permanently infantilized whilst the hemorrhaging of public money to private consultancy firms exacerbates the financial crisis they find themselves in. In universities, you can see this, I think, in how we increasingly see tensions and mental health burdens, primarily caused by what are often incredibly pressured and fraught working conditions, how they spiral into multiple accusations, sometimes between colleagues, as higher educational establishments become littered with formal complaints, accusations and counter-accusations, which are then expensively devolved to the private sector to deal with, meaning universities don't learn how to solve the problems. This is also then what I am thinking of as care as a bolt-on extra, as a purchased offset for structural care pollution. It's part of the wider tendency of public money to be spent to boost the profits of the private sector as it's frittered away on privatized outsourcing in the name of care, which is also facilitating this form of care stripping in universities, not quite on the unhinged level we see in the US under Trump, but one which also has a family resemblance, a shared logic. The sector is becoming more crisis-ridden by the week. So I work in an institution that experienced savage redundancies last year, and these are issues which, to a greater or lesser degree, affect us all. So I would argue that these are processes we need to understand more capaciously, publicise more extensively, and fight against more collectively through day-to-day multiple vectors, which can link up at scale, through day-to-day actions, through union activity, through public policy, and through wider politics. At the moment, from my perspective, we have a kind of centre-right Labour government, which has facilitated national insurance increases that have in effect more or less cancelled out the effects of the tuition fee increases, whilst too many institutions fritter away a lot of money on consultants. And the HE secretary doesn't yet seem to particularly care about HE, its inequalities and its crises. At the same time, we've seen what happens when centre-left governments are kicked to the curb, and the rise of the far right and reform is increasingly obviously a very substantial threat to universities and to care. The care stripping and the privatisations they would introduce would be off the scale. And it is very important, I think, to be aware that reform are now trying to court the youth by appealing to young people, including students. So I would argue that we need a much stronger vision about collective care, and we also need multiple forms of action. There are some promising signs, I think, in the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, curbing some of the power of privatised school academies and kind of taxing private schools, school fees, for which she has received a lot of criticism. But similarly, I think there's a lot of scope to push back on the corporate exploitation of universities that could appeal to lots of different forms of political interest groups in terms of arguments against wasting resources. So one very simple strategy that could, I would argue, should be implemented, for instance, is to put a cap or a ceiling on the percentage universities are allowed to spend on consultancies. Most universities in the UK have spent tens of millions on consultancies, and it's becoming an increasing major financial drain on a crisis-ridden sector. There's interestingly a dialogue around this in Australia, but not much in the UK. So I would argue, therefore, that an alternative model of higher education that's caring, ones that we need right now are ones which move away from the destructive drives of our neoliberal half century. They are ones which would cap drastically, at the very least, the reservoirs of public money flowing to privatized consultants. They would act as anchor institutions in local communities, as decent employers paying a living wage, engaged in the ecosystems of their communities. They would view students as citizens engaging in learning and education, not as consumers or as cash cows to be milked. They would prize cooperation over competition with, between, and beyond the university. They would place the public good above private wealth. They would be prioritized by policy, and they would be funded well. They would revive the mission of part-time and lifelong learning, creating a more expansive imaginary of university as a community. And they will enable international cooperation and be anti-authoritarian, open, egalitarian, and democratic. So words like these might be very abstract, but I think they're also very necessary to orient ourselves. And all of these tendencies have precedents, they have echoes of existence and proof of practical possibility in threads from the past. And it's up to us, I would argue, all of us, to draw them together in these times of corporate care washing and care stripping, and to reinvent them for today. Thank you.